Have you ever imagined surviving the end of the world without being able to see anything around you? What would it be like to wake up on an ordinary morning, going about your seemingly normal routine, and then within minutes, feel like the entire planet had changed forever? My name is Michael Turner. I live outside Cleveland, Ohio, and this is the true story of how I survived the first 12 hours of the alien invasion. I didn't see the sky burst into flames. I didn't see the giant ships hovering over the buildings, nor did I witness with my own eyes the city being reduced to ashes. I'm blind, and yet, or perhaps precisely because of that, I sensed their arrival in a way many others couldn't. That morning, everything seemed the same. I woke up early as usual and went about my daily routine, fumbling around the kitchen, making my coffee with my hands and the familiar sounds around me. Hearing the coffee maker hiss was my signal that the day was beginning like any other. Then I walked to the local restaurant, where I always sat at the same table by the window just to feel the warmth of the sun on my face. For many, these were simple gestures, but for me, they were anchors that kept me connected to the world. I couldn't see the movement on the street, but I knew every footstep on the sidewalk, every neighbor's voice, every sound of a passing car. Normalcy was my invisible map, but it was precisely this normality that began to shatter before me. On the way back, I noticed the silence. It wasn't an ordinary silence, that heavy emptiness that seems to press the air against your chest. No birds sang. Dogs, who always barked in the distance, suddenly fell silent. I felt the ground vibrate beneath my feet, at first faint, like a heavy truck passing by, then more intense, as if something much larger were approaching. Have you ever felt that kind of silence that's so loud it's deafening? That's how I knew something was wrong. Minutes later, the sky exploded. I didn't see it, but I heard it. The first explosions echoed so loudly it felt like the whole world was shattering. The metallic sound, something I'd never heard before, cut through the air like blades. People began running down the street, pushing each other, shouting things I couldn't understand amid the chaos. A car crashed just meters away, and the sound of shattering glass mingled with the screams of despair. I knew that my city, the same one where I'd spent my life trying to live in peace, was no longer the same. The strangest thing is that, while many screamed about the green lights cutting through the sky and the gigantic ships hovering over Cleveland, I captured everything differently. Every detail reached me through sounds, vibrations, and smells. The smell of smoke invaded my nostrils. The vibration of crumbling buildings made the ground shake like an earthquake. I didn't need to see it to understand. Something superhuman had arrived. Stay with me until the end, because what I'm about to share now may surprise you. I also noticed people's reactions. Some ran in panic, others tried to hide inside shops and houses, and there were those who simply stood paralyzed. My blindness, which had always been seen as a weakness, in that moment transformed into a different kind of vision. I didn't see what others saw, but I wasn't paralyzed by the horror of the images either. I simply listened, absorbed, and reacted. This transformation in the way I perceived the world was what gave me the chance to survive. As I walked with my cane, listening to the sounds of destruction around me, I knew these were no ordinary explosions. There was a rhythm, a cadence to the impacts, as if it wasn't just destruction, but something calculated. The sound of the approaching ships seemed to pulse in the air, a low hum that made my chest vibrate. It was impossible not to sense there was intelligence behind this chaos. With every step, every breath, I became certain this wasn't just a natural disaster or a human attack. This was their arrival. And it was precisely in this contrast between my blindness and the desperate vision of others that I began to perceive a hidden truth. Perhaps the aliens weren't just destroying, perhaps they were studying, observing, choosing. This made me understand that my next decisions would be crucial. After all, surviving the first hours of an alien invasion isn't just about running or hiding. It's about learning to hear, feel, and interpret the world in a completely new way. As I tried to grasp every detail of those sounds, I felt the entire city breathing in desperation. The ground vibrated as if it had a life of its own. Screams mingled with explosions, and every step was a gamble between continuing or being swallowed up by the chaos. That feeling of being on edge, unsure if the next second would be my last, is something that has never left me, and that's precisely why sharing this story matters so much. I know that everyone listening now carries their own memories of fear, of moments when control slipped from their grasp and everything seemed to fall apart. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below with what resonated most with you so far. Your perception, The way you see this narrative is what brings this space of exchange to life, and I really want to hear how it resonates with you. And since we're all in this together, I also want to ask you something simple but very important. Like this video if you believe stories like this deserve to continue being told. This gesture, though seemingly small, is what helps this channel grow, reach more people, and keep this conversation about survival, invasion, and humanity alive amidst the impossible. And of course, if you're not already a subscriber, please do so. This ensures you'll continue following each new chapter of this journey, each revelation and each detail that can change the way you see or feel the world around you. Your participation, here's what makes this community exist, and I truly appreciate you being a part of it. Because in the end, telling this story isn't just about reliving a trauma, it's about transforming memories into something that connects, provokes, and makes us reflect together. And it's this unity that will take us even deeper into what's to come. Back then, before the world morphed into something unrecognizable, my days were guided by a simple routine, yet one filled with meaning that only those who live in darkness truly understand. I lived on the outskirts of Cleveland, Ohio, in a neighborhood that always felt the same. Mornings began with the cold tap of a cane on the sidewalk, each sound echoing like a compass telling me where I was. The wind blowing from the north told me whether the weather would be mild or if rain was coming. The hurried footsteps of people heading to work, the clatter of children's bicycles, the smell of fresh bread from the corner bakery, all of it formed an invisible map that guided me more precisely than any vision could offer. I used to leave home early, not just to exercise, but because the world at that time seemed quieter, easier to decipher. My cane touched the ground, and with each tap, I felt confirmation that I was on the right path. The sidewalk in front of the barbershop always had a slight unevenness that made me smile, because it was proof that I had arrived near the city center. A few meters later, I turned left and arrived at the local restaurant, where I was always greeted with the same warm greeting from the waiter. There I'd order the same strong black coffee and sit by the window, not to watch the hustle and bustle of the street, but to feel the sunlight warm my face. It was my ritual, my way of feeling part of the city's flow. Meanwhile, the radio played in the background, broadcasting the day's news, and I paid attention to every detail, the weather forecast, political commentary, and sometimes some international news item that seemed too distant to care about. For me, the sound of the radio was more than information. It was an anchor that connected me to the world I couldn't see, but which was still mine. In a way, this routine gave me security. The predictability of sounds and smells was a comfort that sustained my mindset in the face of difficulties. I was often asked if I missed my sight, and my answer was always the same. I learned to see differently. People underestimate the power of hearing, the way details reveal themselves behind the scenes of everyday life. The sound of a newspaper being flipped through, the click of a pen at the restaurant register, the nervous laughter of someone meeting an unexpected friend, all of these formed my own mental snapshot of the day. I remember that on that particular morning, nothing seemed different. The smell of bacon wafting from the kitchen, the hum of the coffee maker, the clinking of cups. I even allowed myself to relax, thinking about how strangely balanced life can be when you focus on the small details. But this sense of normalcy, which had always held me together, was about to be shattered in a way I never imagined. The contrast is that, accustomed to living in darkness, I trusted the rhythm of each sound to organize my life. I depended on the consistency of people and the environment to feel at peace. But that day, those same sounds that had always guided me began to fail. A puppy that always barked at 8 a.m. didn't bark. The neighbor's car, which religiously started the engine before work, wasn't there. The radio, for some reason, began broadcasting an emergency bulletin that didn't make sense to me at the time. It was as if the world was preparing for something, and I was the only one not being given a clear warning. This reminder of routine is important because it shows how the transformation came suddenly, without warning, like a sharp cut in a song that had always played the same way. It's curious to think that it was precisely my simple life that made me notice the first signs of change. The silence, the emptiness, the details that would escape anyone else's eyes were, for me, clear signs that something was wrong. Perhaps this is the hidden truth of life. Sometimes what seems like a limitation becomes a unique way of seeing beyond what is visible. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because it is in this contrast between the simple routine and the chaos that suddenly arose that the real journey begins. Comment. This makes sense to me. The route home was always predictable. Every corner, every broken sidewalk, every voice that repeated itself at the same time, as if life were an invisible clock guiding my steps. That morning, I followed this silent route with the tranquility of someone who already knows every detail without needing eyes. But it was precisely this confidence that allowed me to realize something had changed. The first sign wasn't a scream, nor an explosion. It was silence. The kind of silence that brings not peace, but unease. The birds, which always sang in the neighborhood trees, had stopped. Mrs. Miller's puppy, which never stopped barking when anyone passed by her house, was quiet. It was as if life had paused, as if an invisible hand had erased all the sounds that formed my daily map. At first I tried to rationalize. Maybe it was just coincidence. Maybe the birds had migrated. Maybe the dog was sick. But there was something different in the air. Something dense, heavy, that seemed to press against my ears. I took a deep breath and realized that even the wind seemed to have lost the courage to blow. That silence was unnatural, forced. I didn't need to see to know that something impossible was happening. It was then that the first boom rent the air. A distant sound, yet so powerful, it made the ground vibrate beneath my feet. My heart raced, and I instinctively gripped my cane tighter. Seconds later came another sound, this time metallic, echoing through the sky as if gigantic engines were tearing through the clouds. The noise was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't a plane, it wasn't a helicopter, it wasn't human at all. It was something that seemed to pulse, like a low hum mixed with a mechanical roar. The people around me began to react. First, murmurs, low, confused voices trying to understand what was happening. Then, screams, bodies running in every direction, hurried footsteps pounding against the asphalt. I heard mothers calling for their children, men desperately trying to unlock cars, and even the dull slam of doors slamming shut. Each sound was a portrait of the transformation that was beginning. The world, until then orderly, had shattered before my ears. I turned toward the city center, guided only by intuition, and heard the sound of something breaking high above. People screamed, "My God, it's falling," and "Look at the sky," but I couldn't look. For me, the scene was formed by the collision of sounds. The metallic clang followed by a muffled explosion, then the roar of fire consuming the air. This was the beginning of the end of the routine I knew. Perhaps it was at that moment that I realized a hidden truth. Seeing doesn't mean understanding. While everyone was paralyzed by the images of what was approaching, I simply absorbed the signals coming from the ground, the air, and people's hearts. The psychological impact of not being able to see became a shield against the visual terror. I couldn't see ships, but I felt every detail of their presence. It was as if my blindness had granted me a new form of perception. The vibrations grew more intense. The air grew thick with static electricity, and the metallic sounds were replaced by something even more frightening, a low hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once. People were shouting, "They're here!" and I knew exactly what they were talking about. I didn't need to see it to believe it. My entire body reacted to their presence as if every cell knew something non-human had arrived. It was at that moment that I felt the first real impact. The ground shook like an earthquake. Objects fell all around me. I heard the sound of a storefront shattering, metal poles vibrating until they nearly bent. The air filled with a smoky, burning chemical smell, unlike any ordinary fire. It wasn't just destruction. It was calculated, as if each explosion had a purpose. The world wasn't just being attacked, it was being studied. I kept walking, but now my steps were uncertain. The cane tapped the floor, and each tap seemed to echo louder than before, as if the room had transformed into a vast, empty hall. It was in this contrast that I felt the impact. Before, each tap of the cane had given me security. Now it reminded me that I was alone in unfamiliar territory. The silence had been broken, but what came in its place was even worse. Maybe I couldn't see it, but I could feel that something impossible was happening. And that feeling, that certainty etched into every part of my body, was what pushed me forward. Because somehow I knew that those first explosions were just the beginning, that the metallic sounds in the sky were just the harbinger of something much bigger. Because those first signs were not just noises in the air, they were omens of a transformation that would change not only the city, but also the way I saw survival itself. What followed was as if the very heart of the city had been ripped out in one fell swoop. Suddenly the silence turned into a chorus of despair. People ran in every direction, screams piercing the air, each voice filled with the same mixture of fear and disbelief. I could hear the sound of feet pounding against the asphalt, the scrape of bags and backpacks falling to the ground, and even the sound of bodies colliding in the rush to escape something that seemed impossible to face. I didn't need to see to sense that everyone was being swallowed by the same wave of panic. Chaos ensued in seconds. Cars that had previously flown orderly through the streets now became uncontrolled weapons, crashing into each other on corners, skidding into poles, and emitting that screeching metallic sound that sends shivers down your spine. With each collision, a new burst of screams erupted. I flinched instinctively as a car lost control and crashed so close to me that I felt the heat of the overheated engine and the strong smell of fuel escaping into the air. The mixture of smoke, burning rubber, and dust filled my nostrils, making every breath more difficult. The ground beneath my feet kept shaking, as if it were alive. These weren't just distant explosions, it was the very weight of the city crumbling. Glass shattered on both sides of the street, doors slammed shut, and at times I could have sworn the air itself vibrated, as if ripped open by something colossal passing overhead. For those who can't see, every detail of sound becomes a mental image, and the images I was constructing at that moment were as terrifying as any vision could be. I moved forward slowly, guided only by the touch of my cane and the memories of the route I knew by heart. Each thud against the ground was a reminder that I was still moving, still alive, but it also reminded me of the vulnerability of relying on sounds amidst the chaos. A horn blared too close, then a dull impact, followed by the sound of metal crunching. People wept. Some prayed aloud, begging for protection. I could feel the weight of tragedy in every sound, as if the entire city were taking its last breath. The contrast between the world I knew and the one changing around me was brutal. An hour earlier, I had walked peacefully, counting the familiar sounds that guided me. Now, those same sounds had vanished, replaced by a deafening chaos that offered no reference point. It was like walking through a maze that changed shape every second. The psychological impact was immediate. I realized that my survival would not depend on seeing or not seeing, but on being able to interpret what was happening through every invisible detail. This was the most painful transformation, and at the same time the most revealing. I clearly remember hearing something like a rapid-fire sequence of explosions, not as loud as the first, but spaced out in a calculated fashion, like huge gunshots coming from somewhere in the sky. People were shouting, "They're shooting!" or "The green lights are everywhere." I couldn't see the lights, but the sound of the explosions echoing against the buildings made me realize that every corner was becoming a trap. The city was being surrounded, little by little. The hidden truth revealed in that instant was simple. It wasn't just destruction, it was a takeover. There was no safe direction to run, no safe haven unthreatened. That was the cruelest impact. The feeling that the enemy had not only arrived, but was dominating the territory in a matter of minutes. Human desperation spread faster than fire, and I could hear it in the frantic pace of the people around me. And yet, amidst all this, I noticed something curious. Amidst so many screams and explosions, there were brief moments of silence, as if everyone had stopped at once, as if fear itself had held its collective breath. These were seconds that gave me a strange clarity. Even without seeing, I could sense that these silences were even more threatening than the sounds. It was as if they heralded the next attack, the next decision, the next revelation. It was in this contrast that I understood that survival wouldn't just mean running away. It would mean learning to decipher the chaos, to transform every noise into information, every detail into a compass. This mindset kept me moving when many stopped, trapped between fear and uncertainty. And somehow, it was this instinct that guided me through the first few hours, without being swallowed by total destruction. Because it was in the midst of this collapse, as the city was being torn apart, that I realized I was not alone, that other people were also trying to survive in ways that would change everything. I clearly remember the moment I realized I wasn't alone in that hell. Until then, my struggle had been solely against the chaos, the fear, and the uncertainty of each step taken in the dark. But amid the deafening din of screams, of engines stalling, of explosions coming from every direction, I heard something different. Voices, closer, filled with despair, but also with a thread of humanity trying to hold on. I followed the sound, my cane firmly on the ground, until I approached a group that had instinctively gathered for cover. The voices were fragmented, laced with sobs, but some words stood out clearly, etching themselves into my skin like images. Huge ships flying overhead, someone said, breathing heavily. Another added, almost breathless, green beams, destroying entire buildings. I couldn't see any of it, but the tremors in each person's voice revealed the magnitude of the terror. It was as if their vocal cords were translating into vibrations what their eyes were witnessing. That's how I met Sarah, a nurse who was shaking so hard her breath was almost a stifled sob. She spoke of saving people, of not being able to abandon those who were injured or paralyzed by panic. Her voice conveyed not only fear but also a determination that contrasted with the collapse around her. There was an emotional strength in her that tried to cling to any sense of purpose, even when all seemed lost. Beside her was Jack, a war veteran who, through the firmness of his words, seemed to be the only one capable of maintaining calm amidst the madness. His voice was deep, steady, and though it carried tension, it conveyed the experience of someone who had faced battles before, though never anything like this. I approached slowly, guided by the sound of their conversations, and was initially greeted with suspicion. They didn't know me, unsure if they could trust another stranger amidst the chaos, but it only took a few seconds for them to realize my condition. You can't see any of this?" Sarah asked, almost as if it were impossible for anyone to be oblivious to the scene. I shook my head and said no. It was at that moment that I felt something curious. While the others were terrified by the images they saw, I was guided only by invisible sensations. My blindness, which had always been seen as a weakness, in that moment became a kind of filter. I wasn't distracted by images of destruction. I only heard, felt, and interpreted. They began to tell me what they saw, and each description became a dark painting in my mind. Jack spoke of the ships as colossal structures that covered the entire sky, launching beams of green energy that tore buildings in half like paper. Sarah described bodies trying to run, some consumed in seconds by explosions, others simply disappearing into the light. Each word brought a painful revelation, but at the same time it kept me grounded in reality. However, what struck me most wasn't the visual details, but the emotional impact of the voices. The nurse spoke through sobs, trying to maintain her composure, but every syllable carried with it the anguish of someone who knew she couldn't save everyone. Jack spoke harshly, but there were small pauses in his breathing, pauses that betrayed that even he couldn't contain the fear consuming him. I sensed the underlying meaning behind the words, the struggle between survival instinct and the need to help others. Being close to them was, in a way, a relief, not because we were safe. Indeed, there was no safe place at that moment, but because hearing their voices reminded me that I was still part of something human. The chaos hadn't managed to completely separate us. There was still community. There was still the possibility of resisting together. This gave me the clarity to understand that, even without sight, I wasn't lost. I was on a shared journey, where each of us offered what we could. Sarah offered care, Jack offered strategy, and I, even blind, offered insight into details that others missed in the midst of the panic. The curious thing is that I began to notice things they didn't understand. As they fixated on the ships and the beams of light, I heard patterns in the sounds, the rhythm of the booms, the cadence of the hums in the air, as if it were part of a calculated war orchestra. This revelation made me think that the aliens weren't just attacking, they were studying, organizing the chaos as part of a larger decision. It wasn't random destruction, it was purposeful. This hidden truth stayed with me for the next few hours and, in a way, changed the way I interpreted each noise. Being with them, however, didn't eliminate the fear. On the contrary, it intensified because now there was responsibility. It wasn't just me trying to survive. Lives depended on each other. The impact of this was brutal. Every choice gained weight. Every movement became decisive. The simple act of deciding to turn left or right could mean the difference between life and death. It was at this point that I realized how our mindsets would be tested, how our transformation would come not only from what we were facing, but also from the decisions we would make amidst the storm. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because the real challenge was not just in recognizing the signs of the invasion, but in how together we managed to face the first hours of survival in a city that was crumbling before us. Right there, I'm on this journey too. The first hours of survival were a mix of instinct, luck, and quick decisions that, so intense, still echo in my memory as if they had happened yesterday. After approaching that small group of survivors, Sarah insisted that we needed to find shelter, somewhere we could at least breathe without feeling as if the next explosion would reach us. That's when Jack, with his firm voice and wartime experience, suggested we head toward an abandoned supermarket a few blocks away. He said he knew the area, and that building could offer us at least a few minutes of protection. The path there seemed endless. Each step was accompanied by the distant, and sometimes not so distant, sound of ships crossing the sky. I couldn't see them, but I could feel them. The air vibrated as if shot through with electric currents, and each time one of those low-pitched hums passed overhead, my entire body instinctively flinched. The ground shook with an inhuman weight, and this sensation made me understand, without needing explanation, that we were facing something far greater than we could handle. The cane became more than my guide. It was almost an extension of my consciousness. I tapped it on the asphalt and, by the sound it gave, I could tell if the space was open or if we were approaching an obstacle. When I brushed against broken glass, I knew there was recent destruction. When I touched crumpled metal, it was a sign of cars that had crashed or been struck by the energy beams. Each touch was a revelation, a way to decipher the behind-the-scenes of that apocalyptic scene that others described with words laden with horror. However, nothing compared to the sensation of being exposed to the sound of the ships. The hum intensified, followed by a wave of heat and vibration that penetrated my skin and reached my bones. At times I thought it was the end, that each new approach would be the last memory I would have. The explosions came soon after, so strong they seemed to shatter the city. Sarah gripped my arm so tightly that her fingers trembled, and even without seeing her face, I knew she was crying. Jack, on the other hand, maintained a rigid posture, but his breathing betrayed the tension. The psychological impact was clear. There was no way to prepare for it, because there was nothing in the human experience that compared. When we finally arrived at the supermarket, the gate was ajar, creaking in the wind. We entered cautiously, and every step inside the building echoed in an uncomfortable silence. I could smell the rotting food on the shelves, mixed with the metallic odor of blood that shouldn't be there. The space seemed empty, yet at the same time charged with invisible presences. It was at that moment that I realized something even more frightening. The silence inside wasn't a relief, it was a trap. Even so, that space gave us a brief sense of refuge. The tension didn't disappear, but we were able to breathe, regroup, and consider our next steps. It was there that I began to understand even more clearly that my blindness, rather than limiting me, could become an advantage. While others were paralyzed by the images of horror, I was guided by sound, by touch, by details that escaped those who relied solely on sight. This gave me a different perception, a mindset that forced me to transform every noise into vital information. There was a moment when everyone held their breath simultaneously. A spaceship flew so low that the supermarket ceiling seemed to tremble in its wake. The sound was almost deafening, and every shelf rattled as if about to fall. It was impossible not to think that this could be our end. And in that moment, I realized that every sound could indeed be my last memory. This thought stayed with me for hours, constantly reminding me that there was no room for error, that every decision had a direct impact on our survival. This initial journey wasn't just about finding shelter. It was about facing the hidden truth that survival would require much more than running or hiding. It would require interpreting signs, understanding patterns, accepting that the transformation had already begun within us. We were being forced to see the world differently, and in my case, that was literal. The impact of this revelation made me realize that even amidst the chaos, there was a unique kind of clarity. Because those first hours inside the supermarket were not just a breath of fresh air in the midst of destruction, but the beginning of a sequence of decisions that would test our ability to resist the impossible. Not seeing the aliens might have saved me, or might have doomed me. That phrase echoed inside my head like a sentence I silently repeated to myself. Everyone around me described what they saw. Bodies being dragged by the light, buildings split in half, enormous ships hovering like predators in the sky. I couldn't see any of it, but each word was enough to feed my mind with images that only existed in the darkness of my imagination. And the truth is, often what we don't see can be even more terrifying than what's revealed before our eyes. As Jack spoke of ships glowing like cities suspended in midair, and Sarah described creatures that seemed to walk among the wreckage, I constructed my own versions of the horror. Every noise became a clue, every vibration in the ground a signal, every unexpected silence a warning that something was about to happen. It was like blindly assembling a jigsaw puzzle, where the pieces were sounds, smells, tremors, and instinct itself. I imagined the monsters by the impact they caused, by the trail of destruction they left, and this created in me a vision that was perhaps even more terrifying than reality. There were times when I wondered, do I have an advantage by not seeing? Because, while others were paralyzed by the image of the enemy, I simply absorbed invisible information and moved on. But at the same time, doubt gnawed at my mind. What if this blindness was also a curse, preventing me from fully understanding what we faced? This duality accompanied me every second, as if survival depended not only on my body, but also on the mindset I chose to adopt in the face of the impossible. Perhaps I saw what they couldn't, the silence, because only those who live in darkness learn to appreciate the sound of absence. When the world crumbles, our eyes focus on the visible chaos, but our ears capture what lurks behind the scenes. I felt when the birds fell silent, when the air stopped moving, when the breathing of the people beside me changed rhythm. These details were revelations that guided me, hidden truths that showed the invasion wasn't just about fire and destruction. It was about control, about manipulation, about calculated psychological impact. Sarah wept as she described tall creatures with elongated arms and seemingly inhuman movements. Jack, for his part, spoke firmly, but deep down, I could tell from the pauses in his voice that even he couldn't comprehend what was before him. To me, they were just sounds, but those sounds were enough to spark an imagination that grew darker and darker. I didn't need to see the green glow of the beams to sense the threat. It was enough to hear the dull rumble of the explosions and the silence that followed, as if life had been extinguished in seconds. It's strange to think that the lack of vision offered me a kind of internal transformation. I was being forced to rely on a kind of perception most people never experience. This realization made me wonder if perhaps the invasion also had a psychological purpose, to instill fear not just through what was seen, but through what was felt. The hidden truth seemed to be this: the aliens didn't come just to destroy, they came to reconfigure the way we understood reality. Every hour I spent inside that supermarket, every story I heard from others, every vibration I felt in the ground pushed me on a journey that was not only physical, but also mental. The impact was not only outside, in the crumbling world, but also within me. It was as if every sound was a choice, to believe what others saw, or to trust what I felt. And that decision shaped not only my survival, but also my understanding of what was really happening. Perhaps in the end, I was privileged not to see, because what the eyes reveal as certainty, silence reveals as mystery. And it was this mystery that kept me going, that kept me from succumbing to total despair. The truth is that in that invasion, the survivors weren't just those who ran the fastest or had the most weapons. The survivors were those who could interpret the invisible, who accepted the forced transformation of seeing the world from unexpected angles. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because it was in this contrast between what I couldn't see and what I could feel that I realized that the fight for life wouldn't just be against aliens, but also against the limits of my own mind. Inside that dimly lit supermarket, every breath seemed to carry the weight of a decision. The silence was broken only by the occasional noises from outside, distant explosions, breaking glass, engines crashing. It was as if the entire city had become an invisible battlefield, and we were mere small pieces, trying not to be crushed. It was then that I realized that survival depended not just on hiding, but on the choices we were about to make. And the right choice wasn't always the one that seemed most obvious. Jack, with his battle-hardened veteran's bearing, spoke with the firmness of someone who had faced the impossible. His voice was almost a command, heavy with memories of war and a mindset that brooked no submission. He insisted that fighting was the only way to show resistance, that we should seek out weapons, improvise if necessary, but never surrender. If we stand still, they'll find us anyway, he said, breathing heavily, as if unwilling to admit fear, but about to be swallowed by it. Sarah, on the other hand, brought a completely different tone. Her trembling voice didn't hide the compassion that overflowed in every word. She spoke of the screams echoing outside, of the people who were injured, of the bodies that might still be breathing beneath the rubble. For her, it wasn't just about survival, it was about helping. We can't just ignore it, she said. We can't pretend we didn't hear. The emotional impact of these words was enormous. reminding us that we were still human amidst the chaos, and that the line between saving and abandoning was painfully thin. And there I was, trapped between these two opposing forces, trying to sift through every invisible detail to form a meaningful decision. I knew running without direction would be suicide. My cane guided me, but there was no sound map capable of leading us out of a city that no longer obeyed the rules we knew. The sound of ships was omnipresent. The tremors in the ground came from all directions, and every street could be a dead end. I needed to convince them both and myself that survival wouldn't mean choosing the right path but avoiding the wrong one. The clash of these visions created a suffocating tension in the group. Jack paced back and forth, his boots pounding on the supermarket's tile floor like hammer blows of resolve. Sarah, sitting in the corner, was breathing rapidly, as if about to collapse, yet still clung to the purpose of saving someone other than us. I silently absorbed every noise around me, every change in the rhythm of the air, trying to find a way out that would balance the extremes. And it was at that moment that I realized that true transformation didn't just happen out there, in the sky streaked with ships and beams of destruction. It happened within us, in the choices we had to make in seconds, knowing each one could be our last. The hidden truth was that amidst the chaos there was no right or wrong. There was only the decision that would allow us to keep breathing a little longer. When the sound of hurried footsteps echoed outside the supermarket, we all froze. It wasn't human. It wasn't natural. It was a strange cadence, as if several out-of-step legs were dragging the weight of bodies larger than ours. Jack held his breath and whispered, "They're here." Sarah clapped her hands to her mouth to stifle a scream. I only felt the air move, heavy, as if their very presence contaminated the air. And in that instant, it became clear that we had to decide: fight, help, or simply resist in some way. Sometimes survival isn't about choosing the right path but the least wrong. This phrase, which I carry with me to this day, was born there, in that dilapidated supermarket, the moment we understood there was no time for long debates or comfortable reflections. The world had been shattered, and each of us would be forced to shatter together to move on. It wasn't just the threat outside that shaped our actions, but also the way each of us reacted to it, revealing truths we never imagined carrying. Comment here. I'm on this journey too. The first 12 hours were just the beginning. I repeat this to myself to this day, like a mantra echoing in the invisible walls of my mind. Because when I close my eyes, even though for me, there's no difference between opening and closing, I can still feel the weight of those moments when the world seemed to crumble around me, the ground vibrating as if about to split open, the desperate voices calling for help, the sound of ships streaking across the sky like sharp blades ripping through the air. All of this is part of me now, and even after so long I still wonder, did I survive by pure luck, or was there something more? Perhaps fate had drawn this line, guiding my blind steps through the rubble. Or perhaps, in an even more disturbing hypothesis, the aliens let me live on purpose. This doubt is what haunts me on nights when the silence becomes heavy again, recalling the same silence that preceded the invasion. The truth is, no one is ever prepared for such a brutal transformation. I'd lived my entire life relying on sounds, smells, and touches to decipher the world. But that day, all of that was heightened to an unbearable level. Every vibration in the ground was a warning, every sudden silence a hidden revelation, every quickened breath beside me an alert that we were being hunted. The psychological impact was so intense that, at times, I wondered if I was truly alive or if it was just a tortuous memory, a mental framework trying to protect me from what I couldn't fully understand. It's curious how in moments like these, our mindset changes irreversibly. I always believed my limitations made me more vulnerable, but ironically, it was this same darkness that kept me going when others succumbed to the panic of what they saw. I didn't see the energy beams destroying buildings, but I heard the sound of matter shattering. I didn't see the bodies being swallowed by the light, but I felt the void that formed when the screams suddenly ceased. This absence of images gave me a kind of dark clarity, as if I had seen truths that only those without sight can perceive. And yet the question remains, why me? Why did I survive when so many others didn't even have the chance to breathe for a few more seconds? Was there a greater plan? Did my blindness make me irrelevant to them, an insignificant detail amidst the destruction? Or have I somehow become an observed, studied piece, part of an experiment I still can't comprehend? These reflections consume me because I know those 12 hours weren't the end. They were merely the opening of a much longer chapter, a journey in which each decision carried weight and each revelation brought with it new doubts. Survival wasn't simply a matter of running or hiding. It was accepting that we were facing an intelligence that didn't think like us, that didn't fight like us, and that perhaps was more interested in shaping our minds than destroying our bodies. I remember Jack's voice, steady, trying to hold the group together, even as hope seemed to crumble with each explosion. I remember Sarah, crying, yet still insisting on helping, as if compassion were the last flame of humanity amidst the chaos. And I remember myself standing in the dark, trying to interpret sounds no one else heard with the same intensity, trying to convince myself that it made sense. Deep down, each of us was carrying an invisible role in this story, and perhaps that's what the aliens were truly seeking. Not bodies, but responses. The first 12 hours were a test. At least that's how I see it now, looking back. A test that didn't end with the next dawn, but which left such deep scars that I can still feel them today. The journey wasn't just external, it was internal. It was a battle waged within the mind, where the line between fear and courage, between reason and despair, became increasingly blurred. What about you? Have you ever stopped to think about what you would do if you were in my shoes? Imagine for a moment being trapped in the middle of an alien invasion, unable to see anything, relying only on sounds, smells, and the weight of the air around you. Would you flee alone, seeking only your survival? Or would you risk helping those who were as lost as you? These decisions, which seem simple from the outside, take on unimaginable weight when the lives of others are at stake, when the next step could be your last. That's why I want to hear from you. I want to hear your perspective because in the end, this story isn't just mine. It's a reflection on how far we're willing to go when everything we know falls apart. Right here in the comments, what would you do in my place? Would you run away alone or try to help others? I want to hear your answer because perhaps within it lies the key to understanding a little more about what makes us human even in the face of the inexplicable. Telling this story isn't just about reliving the trauma. It's also about building a bridge with those who listen, transforming the memory into something that can generate impact, reflection, and even a new way of seeing life. Perhaps this is precisely what aliens will never understand: our capacity to share, to create community, to transform pain into revelation. The first 12 hours were just the beginning, and I still don't know if I survived by luck, fate, or because the aliens had other plans for me. But I know that as long as this memory lives, it will continue to raise questions that can't be answered with eyes alone, but with the heart. And now I leave it to you. What would you do if you were in my shoes? Write in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective, because perhaps true survival isn't just about staying alive, but about sharing the choices that define us. And if you've made it this far with me, it's because this journey has also resonated with you in some way. That already means a lot. If this content resonated, if it gave you food for thought, or even gave you chills, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel. That way you won't miss the next chapters of this experience we're building together. Also, leave a comment below with the phrase, "I'm with you until the end," so I know who truly walked side by side with me until the very last second of this story. It's this kind of connection that shows we're not alone on this journey. And of course, leave a like on the video in a simple way, just to reinforce this exchange and help keep this conversation alive. There's a video here that complements this topic. Click and continue with me there, because the story is just beginning.